Welcome to Letter Arrived After Death, a Miss Marple mystery, a haunting tale from the heart of Mary Mead. A letter meant to be delivered after death arrives too soon, and days later, its recipient lies cold in her bed. Only Miss Marple senses the truth hidden behind the village's gentle smiles. Where are you listening from tonight? And would you dare open a letter that wasn't meant for the living? The morning sun fell gently over Mary Mead, filtering through lace curtains and glinting off polished teapots in drawing rooms where gossip brewed as quickly as tea. It was one of those serene English mornings when even the distant church bell seemed too polite to interrupt the peace. But peace, as Miss Marple often said, was a very fragile thing in a village like theirs, especially when the post arrived. Mrs. Emily Farrow, a widow of tidy habits and brisk manners, found the letter waiting upon her breakfast tray. The handwriting was unmistakable. Mr. Geoffrey, Pritchard's, her late brother's solicitor from Market Bexley. Her teacup trembled slightly as she broke the seal, expecting another tedious matter about her brother's estate. But as her eyes ran over the first lines, her lips parted in confusion, then fear. "My dear Mrs. Farrow, as per your instructions, I have delayed the delivery of this letter until after your passing." She stared at the words, as though they'd rearranged themselves into nonsense. After your passing. It was impossible. She was very much alive. The letter, according to the envelope's postmark, had been sent 2 days ago. By every earthly standard, she should not have received it. By mid-morning, the entire village knew about Mrs. Farrow's ghostly letter. The postmistress, Miss Clegg, mentioned it to Mrs. Bantry at the greengrocer's, who in turn told her gardener, who told the vicar's wife. And by the time word reached Miss Marple, who was trimming dead leaves off her geraniums, the tale had already grown arms and legs. Some said the letter came from a dead man. Others swore it foretold a death yet to come. Miss Marple, listening quietly over tea at the vicarage that afternoon, made no remark until Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, "I declare, Jane, it's positively unearthly. To receive a letter meant to be sent after one's death, why, it's like a curse. Or perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, stirring her tea, "a mistake in timing. Mistakes, dear Dolly, often tell us more than they mean to." That evening, Mrs. Farrow dined alone, her nerves still raw. She had locked the strange letter in her writing desk and poured herself a brandy before retiring early. Her house, Whodunit Cottage, stood on the edge of the village, quiet, proper, and surrounded by hedges that kept away curious eyes. At 10:30, the lamplight in her bedroom flickered out. By morning, she was dead. The doctor called it heart failure. She had always been delicate. After all, but Miss Marple's soft blue eyes saw unease in the faces around the village. Something about that letter lingered like a shadow. When Constable Holmes, a good lad, though somewhat slow to think before he spoke, mentioned over tea that he'd seen a man near Whodunit Cottage that night, someone in a dark coat, couldn't make out who. Miss Marple merely nodded, knitting needles poised in midair. "A dark coat," she murmured. "Yes, dear, that's often the color chosen by those who wish not to be noticed." And though the world thought Mrs. Farrow's death natural, Miss Marple, in her quiet heart, already suspected it was anything but. Dawn broke over Mary Mead with a chastened light. By the time Miss Marple crossed the lane with a covered dish, Whodunit Cottage had the peculiar hush that clings equally to illness and to scandal. And the hedge outside seemed to listen. Constable Holmes, big-eared and earnest, guarded the path. "Marple," he said. "Doctor says the heart gave out." Miss Marple nodded and let her gaze settle on small, sensible things. The bell-pull hung a fraction askew, as if a cautious hand had tried it and thought better. A scuff grazed the lower gatepost, too low for the postman's bag and too recent for weather. Inside, the drawing-room had been put to rights, but people rarely tidy evenly. On the tray, there was 1 cup, yet 2 crumbs kept each other company on the side plate. The bureau was locked. The key On a ribbon lay neatly pinned to Mrs. Farrow's apron folded on a chair. The ribbon's edge was frayed. The pin's angle was precise. Geoffrey Pritchard's junior clerk arrived breathless, a sallow young man named Hodges, whose hat brim bore a nervous fingerprint. He had come because the letter, so unfortunately worded, had stirred unease in Market Bexley. "There was a sealed enclosure Mrs. Farrow lodged last week," he said. "Mr. Pritchard was to post it under particular circumstances." "Did he post it?" Holmes asked. "Not that one," Hodges muttered. "What the lady received was different, or should have been." "Who knew?" Miss Marple asked, wool-soft. "Mr. Pritchard, myself, and those in the waiting room," Hodges said. "Mrs. Bellamy, from the old rectory, and Mr. Lionel Wake, the retired actor. He waited in the corridor. He did not go in." "Didn't he?" Miss Marple said mildly, and the clerk's certainty slipped by half an inch. The village enacted its ancient right of speculation. "Mrs. Bantry," insisted Mrs. Farrow, "had enemies. Quiet enemies are the worst." Jane, while the vicar's wife, recalled a quarrel at the Women's Institute over a missing brooch. Miss Marple listened, head bent over her knitting. "What troubles me," she said at last, "is not the letter's paper, but its grammar. One does not instruct delivery after your passing unless the passing is expected within a manageable calendar. When death is scheduled so confidently, someone has been arranging the schedule." The vicar's wife looked small and stricken. "Then she was frightened?" "She was methodical," Miss Marple said. "Her rooms were tidied by a strange hand. Yet someone knew where the brandy was kept." Toward evening, Miss Marple took the long way home and paused where the hedge narrowed to a pinch of shadow. A crisp scent of soap drifted from a tiny tear in the hawthorn. On the thorn, a short thread of dark wool had snagged. Beyond, the lane opened toward Lionel Wake's cottage, the one with fading theatrical posters. She noted a new vigilance about the place. Back at her cottage, she wrote 2 notes, one to Mr. Pritchard, requesting a list of all sealed enclosures in his keeping, and one to Mrs. Bellamy, inquiring, as if by afterthought, whether her brooch had ever been found. People, she reflected, are forever putting on little plays, whether or not they have trod a stage. The trick is to observe the audience as much as the actors. Mrs. Farrow had been an audience of 1, and someone insisted on applause at the wrong moment. If so, there would be a rehearsal somewhere, some tidy error, some cue called a beat too soon, some prop laid down and picked up again with the wrong hand. She sipped her tea, smiled to herself, and planned the morning. She would take muffins to Lionel Wake and ask, with grandmotherly innocence, whether he preferred jam or marmalade. Preferences are revealing, and people betray themselves over small comforts. As for the letter that should not have come, she thought it less a message than a performance with poor timing. And timing, on and off the stage, is nearly everything. Quietly, the following morning, Miss Marple rose early, her mind already occupied with Mrs. Farrow's letter and the strange timing that surrounded it. The October air was crisp and damp with mist, carrying the smell of earth and wood smoke. She wrapped a soft grey shawl about her shoulders and tucked a small parcel of muffins into her basket. By 8:30, she was walking the narrow lane toward Mr. Lionel Wake's cottage. Lionel Wake, once a moderately successful stage actor, had retired to Mary Mead 5 years earlier, trading applause for anonymity. His little thatched cottage, Thespian's Rest, was cluttered with theatrical relics, framed posters, masks, and a faint scent of grease paint that seemed to linger in the draperies. Miss Marple had always found him courteous, even charming, though she never entirely trusted those who smiled too quickly. He answered her knock with exaggerated cheer. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the honor? Not another charity pageant, I hope. My poor knees still recall the last one." "I've brought you muffins," Miss Marple said kindly. "Fresh this morning. I thought you might like them with your tea." "Splendid. Come in, come in." The sitting room was warm and filled with the faint hiss of a gas fire. Miss Marple's eyes moved lightly across the room as she settled into an armchair. On the mantelpiece lay a folded copy of The Market, Bexley Gazette, dated yesterday. Near it, a dark woolen scarf, exactly the sort she had noticed, snagged upon the hedge the night before. "How is poor Mrs. Farrow's house this morning?" Wake asked, pouring tea. "A sad business, I hear." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "So sudden, though I believe she had visitors the evening before." "Visitors? Oh dear me. Surely not. She was a recluse of the purest order, lived for her cats and her curtains." "One does hear things. The constable mentioned a figure seen near her gate, a man in a dark coat, I believe." For a fraction of a second, the actor's hand froze above the sugar bowl. Then the charm returned, quick as a mask snapping into place. "A dark coat? My dear lady, half the village wears dark coats this time of year." "Quite right," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Still, it does make one wonder what sort of errand would take a man along that road so late." Wake gave a little laugh, perhaps too light. "Some romantic intrigue, no doubt. These villages are full of them." Miss Marple rose, adjusting her shawl. "Yes, indeed. Human nature changes very little, does it not? Thank you for the tea, Mr. Wake. I shall send word if there's another pageant, though I promise no dancing this time." As she stepped into the lane, she glanced back through the misted window. Lionel Wake was standing quite still, the paper in his hand unread, his expression thoughtful in a way that had nothing to do with muffins or charity. Later that day, Miss Marple visited the vicarage. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was sorting envelopes for the Harvest Fund. "Do you think it was her heart, Jane?" she asked anxiously. "The doctor said so. But well, there's been such talk." "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that Mrs. Farrow's heart might have been hurried along." Mrs. Clement gasped. "Murder? Not proven," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea, "but perhaps assisted. I dare say she was frightened enough to make it easy." "What could frighten her?" "She had no enemies." Miss Marple looked up, her expression mild. "Oh, my dear, everyone has enemies. Some are merely more patient than others." That evening brought another visitor, Hodges, the young clerk. He was pale and uneasy as he stood at Miss Marple's gate. "I thought you ought to know, ma'am. That letter Mrs. Farrow received, there's something odd about it. Mr. Pritchard swears it was written months ago but never meant to be sent. His file copy's missing." Miss Marple folded her hands. So, the letter that frightened Mrs. Farrow was never meant to reach her, and yet it did 2 days before she died. "Yes, ma'am. Posted by someone using her brother's old stationery." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Someone with access, then. Someone who wanted her frightened enough to die or to do something rash." When Hodges left, she sat by the window, knitting slowly, her needles clicking in the hush of evening. The lamplight flickered across her face, thoughtful and calm. There was a performance in this village, she was certain well rehearsed and neatly staged, but one actor had forgotten his cue, and Miss Marple, patient as ever, was waiting for him to step back into the light. The following day dawned with a low mist that clung to the roofs and hedgerows, softening the edges of Marymead into something half forgotten. Miss Marple sat by her breakfast table, the post unopened beside her teapot. She had not slept much. Her thoughts had circled endlessly around Mrs. Farrow's letter, the dark-coated figure, and Lionel Wake's too smooth denials. The village was restless now, curious eyes behind curtains, whispers carried from shop to churchyard. Death, Miss Marple reflected, was never as private a matter as one hoped in a place like this. The rattle of the gate latch startled her. It was Constable Holmes, his boots muddy and his cap slightly askew. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple. Thought you'd want to know. Mr. Pritchard, the solicitor, came down this morning. He's been to see Inspector Cray." "Has he indeed? About Mrs. Farrow's estate, I suppose?" "Well, that, and something queer besides. Seems there's a second will unsigned, but clearly written by Mrs. Farrow herself, found in her desk, tucked under that letter." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "A second will? And what does it say?" "Leaves everything to her niece, Miss Lydia Crane. Not a penny to the charities or the housekeeper. like in the first one. This one was never witnessed, so it won't hold water. But it's odd, all the same. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. Odd indeed, particularly if Mrs. Farrow didn't live long, enough to decide whether to sign it. After the constable left, she fetched her hat and went walking toward the far end of the village, where Lydia Crane lodged at the schoolmistress's cottage. Miss Crane was young, barely 30, with clear grey eyes and the air of one who has seen more of life than she chooses to tell. She opened the door at Miss Marple's gentle knock, surprise flickering over her face. "Miss Marple, how kind. You've heard about poor Aunt Emily." "I have, my dear. Such a shock to everyone. I wondered how you were bearing it." Lydia hesitated. "It's strange. I hadn't seen her in months. We were not on the best of terms." "Families rarely are, I find," Miss Marple said kindly, settling herself on a narrow settee. "But I hear she meant to change her will. That must have surprised you." "It did," Lydia admitted. "Aunt Emily could be terribly proper about money. She always said I'd made poor choices because I'd once been engaged to a man she didn't approve of. And was he someone from the village?" A faint color rose to Lydia's cheeks. "No, he was a visitor. An actor, actually. Lionel Wake." Miss Marple paused only a moment, her teacup halfway to her lips. "How very interesting. And your engagement ended when?" 3 years ago, Lydia said softly. "He went back to London, and I stayed. Aunt Emily called it a blessing. I thought I was over it." She gave a small, brittle laugh. "But the night before she died, someone knocked at my window. I didn't see who, only a shadow in the garden. I thought it must be a mistake." Miss Marple looked at her over the rim of her cup. "A shadow in the garden," she repeated thoughtfully. "And the next morning, your aunt was found dead. When she left the cottage, the air felt colder. The mist had thickened, muffling the world. Lionel Wake's name echoed in her thoughts, joined now by a motive that had taken root like ivy. A broken engagement, an inheritance, a frightened old woman, and a forged letter to hasten her death. As she reached the crossroads, she met Mrs. Bantry, flushed with gossip. "Jane, have you heard? That man from the solicitors, Mr. Hodges, he's gone missing. Supposed to be back in Market Bexley by noon yesterday, but never arrived." Miss Marple stopped, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Missing, you say? They found his bicycle by the mill pond, but no sign of him." Miss Marple stood very still, her hand tightening on her basket. The threads of the pattern were beginning to show, faint but unmistakable. One letter had brought death to a woman. Another had vanished with a clerk. And somewhere among them, a liar wore an actor's smile. That evening, she wrote a short note to Inspector Cray, requesting a word in private. It was time, she thought, to test a theory gently, as one might test lace for a hidden tear. Because in Mary Mead, truth never shouted. It whispered, and only those who listened closely enough heard it before it vanished into the mist. Inspector Cray arrived the next morning from Market Bexley, a large man with a tidy moustache and a practical mind that did not easily admit superstition. Miss Marple met him at the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement had kindly provided tea and seed cake. "You've been busy, Miss Marple," he said with a half smile. "The constable tells me you've already spoken with half the village." "One learns more that way," she replied mildly. "People tell policemen what they think they ought to say. They tell old ladies what they really feel." Cray chuckled. "So what do they feel about Mrs. Farrow's death?" "They feel uneasy," she said. "And with reason. I believe Mrs. Farrow was frightened, perhaps not of dying, but of someone who wanted her to. Fear can do dreadful things to the heart, Inspector." Cray leaned back. "You suspect she was frightened into her grave?" "Precisely." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the steam rising from her cup. "The letter was designed to do just that. But fear alone is rarely sufficient motive. I believe the forger wanted her gone quickly for the matter of that new will." Cray nodded. "The niece benefits most if the old lady's gone before signing it." but Miss Crane doesn't strike me as the type." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "She's honest and terribly hurt. But there are others who might act for her, under some pretext of helping. Actors, for instance, are quite good at pretending concern." Cray frowned. "Lionel Wake?" She met his gaze. "He once courted Miss Crane. He's charming, penniless, and, I dare say, capable of persuasion." Farrow discovered they had resumed contact. She might have altered her will again. Then the letter could have been his doing. Perhaps. Though I doubt he wrote it. The tone was too formal, more a solicitor's hand than a lover's. But an actor might persuade a timid clerk to do something foolish. "Ah," Cray said softly. "You mean Hodges?" Miss Marple nodded. "And now he's disappeared." The inspector rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "We dragged the mill pond at dawn. Nothing so far. If he's hiding, it's a poor sort of trick his bicycle left behind, his pay envelope unopened." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "A timid man, easily frightened. I imagine someone promised him it was all a harmless jest, a delayed letter, a bit of mischief. But when he realized what it led to, fear would come quickly then too. Fear. Or guilt." Cray regarded her shrewdly. "You think he's dead?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that if he isn't, someone wants us to believe he is." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another visit, this time to Mrs. Bellamy of the old rectory, who had been in the solicitor's waiting room the day Mrs. Farrow left her letter. Mrs. Bellamy was a stout woman with opinions as polished as her silver tea service. "Oh yes, I remember that day perfectly," she said, fussing with a napkin. Mrs. Farrow was her usual brisk self, but there was some delay. Mr. Pritchard was out, so she had to wait. That Lionel Wake man came in while she was there. Actually, so charming. He spoke to her, I think. Asked after her late brother. Quite the gallant. Miss Marple smiled. Did she seem upset? Well, perhaps a little flustered. She left sooner than she meant to. I thought it odd at the time she forgot her umbrella. "Ah," said Miss Marple. "And who took it after she left?" "Mrs. Bellamy blinked. "Why, Mr. Wake, I believe. He said he'd return it. I suppose he must have." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the embroidery of her gloves. "Yes," she said softly. "I dare say he did return it, just not to her." By the time she walked home, twilight had gathered over the lane. The mist rolled low, catching the last gold of sunset. She paused by the hedge where the thread of dark wool had once snagged. Now, only a faint indentation marked the place. Someone had been careful enough to tidy it. She stood there for a long moment, her breath clouding in the chill air. Somewhere behind these gentle lives, deceit was moving quiet, deliberate, rehearsed, the kind of deceit that required patience and timing. When she reached her gate, she noticed a letter pushed through the slot. The envelope bore no stamp, only her name in a cramped, hurried hand. She opened it slowly. "Miss Marple, don't trust anyone. I didn't mean harm. It's gone too far. Meet me by the mill tonight, midnight. Tell no one. H." She folded the note, her face grave but composed. Midnight at the mill. The play, it seemed, was about to reach its next act, and she intended to be there when the curtain rose. The night was still when Miss Marple left her cottage, wrapped in her dark shawl and carrying only a small lantern. The note from H lay folded in her pocket, its hurried words echoing in her mind. She had told no one, not even Inspector Cray. If Hodges truly wished to speak, any premature alarm might drive him into deeper hiding, or worse, into the hands of whoever sought to silence him. The air hung damp and cold, filled with the faint hum of crickets and the slow turn of the mill wheel down by the stream. She reached the path near the mill just before midnight. Mist rose in pale ribbons from the water, curling around the half-collapsed walls like breath from some sleeping beast. The moon, half-veiled by cloud, offered only a sickly light. Miss Marple kept to the shadow of the trees, her keen eyes scanning the clearing. At first, there was no sound but the water's low murmur. Then, faintly, she heard it a rustle, a cautious footstep behind the mill. She turned, heart steady, and saw a figure step hesitantly from the gloom. Hodges. His face was pale, his collar turned up, eyes darting in every direction. "Miss Marple," he whispered hoarsely. "I didn't know who else to trust. They'll kill me if they find out I came." "My dear boy," she said softly, "you've done right to come. But tell me quickly who is they." He swallowed hard, his breath shivering in the cold. "It was Mr. Wake. He said it was just a bit of theatre. That Mrs. Farrow liked her affairs, handled dramatically. He gave me the letter and told me to post it. I didn't think, oh Lord, I didn't think she'd die." "And, after you did?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "I went to him that evening, told him I was frightened. He laughed, said I'd be fine. Said if anyone asked, I was never there. But when I saw her body carried out the next morning, he broke off, gripping his hair. Then he came to me again yesterday. Said I'd better leave town for a bit. Offered me money. When I refused, he said it was too late anyway. I think he followed me here." A sound sharp, distinct, broke the quiet. A twig snapped near the bank. Hodges froze. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the shadows by the mill door, where something darker than night moved a silhouette, tall and still. "Run, my dear," she said softly, without turning. "Run to the vicarage and fetch help. Quickly now." But Hodges hesitated, trembling. "I can't." Before he could finish, a sudden blow cracked through the air. He gasped and fell forward, the lantern tumbling from Miss Marple's hand as she dropped to her knees beside him. The faint smell of oil filled the air. Hodges was still breathing, but weakly. A dark stain spreading across his shoulder. The figure had vanished into the mist. Moments later, the sound of wheels echoed down the lane, a carriage, or perhaps Inspector Cray's motor. Miss Marple tore a strip from her shawl, pressing it to Hodges's wound. "Stay with me, dear," she murmured. "You've done very bravely." By the time Cray arrived with Constable Holmes, the mist had thickened again, swallowing any trace of the attacker's retreat. They carried Hodges back to the vicarage, where the doctor worked through the night. The wound, though painful, was not fatal. When dawn broke, Miss Marple stood by the hearth, her shawl singed at one edge, her face thoughtful. Inspector Cray looked up from his notes. "He'll live," he said. "A lucky escape. But Wake's nowhere to be found. We'll have the county watch out for him." Miss Marple nodded absently. "He's clever, Inspector, but not as clever as he believes. Actors rarely are. He'll return for something, perhaps to fetch a piece of evidence he forgot, or to destroy one he left behind. Vanity compels them to tidy their performances. You think he'll come back to Mary Mead?" "I'm certain of it," she said quietly, "because he doesn't yet know what I know, that Mrs. Farrow's death began long before that letter arrived. It began with a lie spoken 3 years ago, by a man who never stopped performing." Her eyes lingered on the window, where the last threads of mist curled away from the morning sun. Somewhere out there, she knew, Lionel Wake was watching, waiting for his curtain call. And when it came, she would be ready. The village woke uneasy that morning, with whispers flitting from doorstep to doorstep before the milk was even delivered. Word had spread about the attack at the mill, though no one knew quite how much of it was true. Some said Miss Marple herself had been shot at. Others swore the body of the missing clerk had been found floating in the pond. By noon, every tongue in Mary Mead was busy, and every curtain twitched at the sound of a passing motor car. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly by Hodges's bedside at the vicarage, knitting as the young clerk dozed under morphine. The doctor had declared him out, of danger, though it would be days before he could give a proper statement. From time to time he stirred, murmuring fragments: "The umbrella, the stage door, the letter wasn't mine." Miss Marple noted each word carefully, her mind fitting them together like threads in a tapestry. Inspector Cray entered softly. "He's sleeping?" "For now," she said. "The poor boy's conscience weighs heavier than his wound." Cray sighed, lowering himself into the chair opposite her. "We've telegraphed London for Wake's description. Nothing yet. He's vanished clean." "Not clean, Inspector," she said gently. "Only hastily. There's a difference." He raised an eyebrow. "You think he's still near?" "I think," she said, pausing to snip a loose thread, "that an actor rarely abandons his stage before the final applause. He'll want to see how the play ends." Cray gave a faint smile. "You have a poet's view of murder, Miss Marple." "Not at all," she replied. "Merely a practical one. Vanity, you see, is far more predictable than reason." That afternoon, she asked Constable Holmes to accompany her to Whodunit Cottage. The police seal still hung on the door, but Cray had granted permission for her to tidy her thoughts, as he put it. Inside, the rooms were much as she remembered, quiet, orderly, lifeless. The faint scent of lavender polish lingered in the air. She moved slowly through each room, her eyes taking in details that others might have missed. A faint scrape on the bureau's side where a drawer had been forced open. The neat alignment of papers disturbed only by one sheet, slightly askew. And in the wastebasket, a small scrap of paper with a corner of handwriting still visible. She drew it out, carefully. The ink was faded, but the word Lydia could be made out, followed by something that looked like forgive. Miss Marple placed it in her reticule, her mind whirring. "The letter Mrs. Farrow received frightened her," she said softly. But perhaps it wasn't the first letter she had seen. Perhaps there was another one she wrote herself. As they left the house, Holmes pointed to the narrow path leading toward the wood. "Funny thing, ma'am," he said. "We found footprints there yesterday, 2 sets. One smaller, one larger. Looked like someone met her before she died." "Or after," Miss Marple murmured, to make it appear as though she had gone out before retiring. That evening, she walked to the vicarage again. The doctor had just left. Hodges was awake but pale. When he saw her, fear flickered in his eyes. "He's coming back," he whispered. "I heard them talking in the hall. He'll come for me." "No one will harm you here," Miss Marple said kindly, taking his hand. "But you must tell me, dear, about the umbrella. You spoke of it last night." His lips trembled. It was Mrs. Farrow's. Left, at the solicitor's. Mr. Wake took it. Said he'd return it himself. When I asked why, he laughed. Said it would be useful." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her knitting slowed. "Useful," she repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose it was. A lady's umbrella, quite ordinary, but the handle hollow, perhaps." He stared at her, wide-eyed. "You know?" "I guessed," she said gently. "The little things always matter most." Before she could ask more, a knock sounded at the door. The vicar entered, holding a telegram. "For you, Miss Marple. It's from Inspector Cray." She took it and unfolded the slip. Wake sighted in Market Bexley. Bought train ticket to London but never boarded. Believed, hiding locally. Possible accomplice female. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the final word. A female accomplice. Lydia Crane, perhaps, but not of her own design. A young woman easily deceived, an old woman easily frightened, a clerk easily led. Yes, it all fit. Only one piece remained, the performance's final act. As she looked up, she saw Hodges drifting back into uneasy sleep. The candlelight trembled across his bandaged shoulder. Outside, the wind rustled the ivy against the window pane, soft and persistent. Somewhere in that darkness, Miss Marple knew, Lionel Wake was watching the stage he had so carefully arranged. She folded the telegram and slipped it into her sleeve. "It won't be long now," she said, quietly to herself. "The curtain is about to fall, and actors, however clever, always forget their exits." By the next morning, the mist had lifted, but the tension in Mary Mead had not. The little village, with its hollyhocks and quiet lanes, seemed to breathe uneasily. as though it too sensed the presence of something false among its familiar faces. Miss Marple was up early, her kettle singing softly on the stove, her thoughts sharper than the morning air. She had pieced together most of the puzzle now, though one small corner still eluded her: the letter Mrs. Farrow had supposedly written to herself, and the strange mention of forgiveness. Forgiveness, Miss Marple knew, was a word that appeared only when there had been something to forgive. She left her cottage just after 9, walking briskly toward the railway lane that curved behind the post office. Inspector Cray had promised to call from Market Bexley if Wake had been sighted again, and the postmistress, Miss Clegg, was the likeliest to hear first. The little shop smelled of dust and string, with neat rows of envelopes and the faint perfume of stale ink. "Morning, Miss Marple," Miss Clegg said, her hands busy tying a parcel. "You've heard, I expect. That actor, fellow Lionel Wake, they say he was seen near the old rectory last night. Gave poor Missus Bellamy such a fright she dropped her shopping." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "Did she say what he was doing?" "Walking fast," she said, "and looking about like a hunted man." "Oh, I do hope the police catch him soon. It gives one quite the shivers." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, I imagine it would. You haven't had any unusual post this morning, have you?" Miss Clegg frowned. "No, nothing odd unless you count the envelope for Miss Lydia Crane. No stamp, hand-delivered early before I opened up. I was going to send it up to her with young Tom." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the small, ivory-colored envelope lying beside the till. The handwriting was bold, masculine, and familiar. "If you don't mind, dear," she said gently. "I think I'll take that myself. Miss Crane might prefer a familiar face delivering it." The postmistress hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Of course, Miss Marple. You're far better company than I am for such things." As Miss Marple walked toward the schoolmistress's cottage, she turned the envelope over in her gloved hands. There was no seal, only the initials L.W. scrawled in one corner. She could almost hear the man's voice, smooth, practiced, coaxing. The letter felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried not just words but intent. Lydia Crane opened the door in a housecoat, her eyes red-rimmed from another sleepless night. "Miss Marple," she said, startled. "Is something wrong?" "No, my dear, only something that requires care." Miss Marple handed her the envelope. "This was left for you at the post office. It's from Mr. Wake, I believe." Lydia stared at it as though it were alive. "From Lionel?" she whispered. "But he wouldn't. Not now. I think, perhaps, he would," Miss Marple said quietly. "Would you mind if I were present while you read it?" With trembling hands, Lydia broke the flap and unfolded the paper. There were only a few lines, written in a rushed, uneven hand. "Lydia, my darling, all has gone wrong. The old fool died too soon, and the boy has betrayed me. Meet me at the boathouse. By dusk we can still leave tonight. Trust no one but me. L." For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Lydia dropped the letter, shaking her head. "He's mad," she whispered. "I told him I wanted no part in any of this. He said it was only to frighten her, to make her change her will back. I didn't know he'd gone that far, Miss Marple. I swear I didn't." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand over hers. "I believe you, my dear, but I also believe he intends to make certain no one can contradict him. If he asks you to meet him, it will not be for love's sake." Tears filled Lydia's eyes. "What should I do?" "You must do precisely as he asks," Miss Marple said softly, but with a small adjustment. "You will go to the boathouse, but you will not go alone." When Inspector Cray arrived an hour later, she showed him the letter and laid out her plan. Cray frowned deeply. "It's dangerous, Miss Marple. The man's desperate." "Anything." "Oh, quite," she said serenely. "But desperate men make mistakes, and Lionel Wake's vanity will not let him flee before delivering his final speech." By dusk, the boathouse stood half in shadow, half in the watery gleam of sunset. The reeds whispered softly along the banks, and a faint ripple disturbed the surface of the lake. Lydia sat on a crate by the water's edge, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale. Hidden among the trees a few yards away, Miss Marple and Inspector Cray waited in silence, the inspector's revolver heavy in his hand. The crunch of footsteps came at last. Lionel Wake appeared, his once carefully groomed hair in disarray, his eyes bright and feverish. "Lydia," he hissed. "Quickly, we haven't much time. They'll be searching the trains by now." She rose, trembling. "Lionel, please, what have you done?" "Mrs. Farrow Hodges." He caught her wrist sharply. "Don't say their names. None of that matters. Now. We'll be gone before they find him. I did it for us, don't you see? She was changing her will, giving everything to you, then talking about cutting me off. It wasn't supposed to go this way. She just frightened herself to death. The silly old woman." His voice cracked on the last word, the confident tone faltering. Then he drew something from his coat pocket, a small pistol, dull in the fading light. "We'll leave together," he said, though his hand shook. "Or not at all." Lydia stepped back, her voice a whisper. "Lionel, please, don't." That was when Miss Marple stepped forward from the shadows, her voice calm and low. "Mr. Wake," she said, "you might lower that revolver. I'm sure you're quite tired of performing by now." He spun around, startled, but before he could react, Inspector Cray emerged from behind her, weapon drawn. "Drop it, Wake. It's over." For a heartbeat, Wake froze, the actor's instinct struggling against the man's fear. Then, with a bitter laugh, he tossed the pistol into the reeds. "Well," he said hoarsely, "every play must end." As the constables led him away, Miss Marple placed an arm around Lydia's shoulders. "He loved the stage too much," she murmured. "Even his crimes had to be dramatic." Cray turned to her, half in admiration. "You knew he'd try to meet her?" "Oh, yes," she said gently. "There are few things more predictable than a man who cannot bear to be forgotten." The lake shimmered faintly behind them, reflecting the last light of the dying sun. The performance was over at last, and the curtain, Miss Marple thought with quiet satisfaction, had fallen precisely on cue. The quiet that settled over Mary Mead in the days following Lionel Wake's arrest was not the kind that brought peace. It was the taut silence that follows a storm, when the air still trembles with what has been broken. People went about their business with the air of those who have looked too closely at something they do not wish to see again. At the vicarage, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Cray beside the fire, their tea cooling between them. The official business had been done, Wake charged with attempted murder and forgery, Hodges recovering steadily, but to Miss Marple's mind, the story was not quite finished. Cray leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "We've his confession in part," he said. "Enough to satisfy the court, I suppose. He admits to forging the letter, admits to frightening Mrs. Farrow with the intent of forcing her heart to fail. But something still doesn't fit, does it?" Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. "You've noticed it too?" He nodded. "If he was clever enough to forge a letter and manipulate a death, why leave so much trail behind? The wool on the hedge, the letter in the post, the hand-delivered note to Miss Crane, it's all a little too convenient." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. Mr. Wake was theatrical, not foolish. Vanity made him reckless, but not careless. "No, Inspector. The clumsiness of those clues was deliberate." Cray frowned. "You mean someone else wanted him caught?" "I mean," she said, setting her needles aside, "that someone wanted him to appear guilty of more than he truly was." The inspector stared into the fire. "You think there was another player?" "Oh, yes," she said, her voice low and steady. "The accomplice you mentioned in your telegram, the one you thought might be Miss Crane. But it wasn't Lydia at all. It was someone older, quieter, and far more cunning." Cray blinked. "Older? Who?" "Mrs. Bellamy," Miss Marple said gently. "Of the old rectory." He stared at her in astonishment. The woman who reported seeing Wake that night? Precisely, Miss Marple replied. And who happened to be at the solicitor's office the day Mrs. Farrow left her letter? Who lent an umbrella that was never returned? Who spoke of Lionel Wake with just the right tone of indulgence? You see, she played her part very well indeed. Cray shook his head slowly. But why? What could she gain? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Money, Inspector, though not for herself. Her son, as you may recall, is heavily in debt in London. Mrs. Bellamy is not a wealthy woman, but she was once Mrs. Farrow's closest friend. She knew of the second will, and she knew it favored Miss Crane. A little persuasion, a little guilt, and she saw an opportunity. Wake would forge the letter, frighten Mrs. Farrow, and be discredited when she died. Lydia would inherit nothing. The old will would stand, and Mrs. Bellamy's charitable legacy would come through instead. Only Wake became greedy, and when Hodges panicked, everything began to unravel. The inspector's expression darkened. So Mrs. Bellamy framed Wake to keep her own hands clean. Exactly, and she nearly succeeded. Cray rose, pacing the rug. You're certain? Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied nod. Quite. There's one thing actors and liars always forget. Inspector, the consistency of truth. Lies, like costumes, must be changed to fit each scene. And Mrs. Bellamy's story has already changed twice. She claimed she saw Wake near the rectory that night. But if you recall, the constable's report placed her at home, ill with a headache. She said she lent an umbrella at the solicitor's. Yet the maid insists it was already missing from her stand that morning, and she spoke of Mrs. Farrow's fear with remarkable detail for someone who was supposedly unaware of the letter's contents. Cray stared into the fire, absorbing her words. If you're right, she's dangerous. Dangerous? Miss Marple's eyes glinted. No, Inspector, merely desperate. But desperation is a poor companion to deceit. I expect she's already making preparations to leave. If you were to visit her now, I think you'd find her trunks half-packed. He hesitated. Would you come with me? I think that would be best, she said quietly, rising and gathering her shawl. Sometimes the truth is easier to hear from a friend. The old rectory stood at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls bathed in the dull gold of late afternoon. Mrs. Bellamy received them in the drawing room, her face a portrait of composure, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. Inspector, Miss Marple, she said with a faint smile. Such an unexpected visit. I suppose this is about that dreadful man Wake. I do hope they lock him away for good. Cray said nothing. Miss Marple looked around the room, her eyes resting briefly on a half-open trunk near the window, its lid concealing what appeared to be a folded umbrella with a polished ivory handle. You're leaving us, then? She asked gently. Mrs. Bellamy stiffened. Yes. I thought a little. Holiday might be in order. London, perhaps. The village has been rather oppressive of late. I dare say, Miss Marple said softly. Guilt can make the air quite close. The older woman's cup rattled against its saucer. I beg your pardon? You needn't pretend, Miss Marple went on kindly. Lionel Wake was vain, foolish, and cruel. But he was not the mind behind the plan. He never would have thought to use that letter, or to frighten Mrs. Farrow through a reminder of her own guilt. You did that, didn't you? You knew of the quarrel between her and your son, and you knew she meant to cut your family out entirely. You only needed a man reckless enough to do your bidding. Mrs. Bellamy's eyes darted to the inspector, then back to Miss Marple. You can't prove any of it. Oh, but I can, Miss Marple said gently. The umbrella handle, my dear. You hid the original letter inside it, the one Mrs. Farrow wrote to you, asking forgiveness for your son's disgrace. You used it to forge the second, the one that frightened her into death. Hodges never saw that part, did he? He only posted what Wake handed him. But you kept the real letter close. perhaps as a souvenir of your success. A little too close. There was silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Missus. Bellamy's composure cracked like old porcelain. She had everything, she said suddenly, her voice low and trembling. All her smug morality, her fine furniture, her pity. And my boy, my poor boy, she ruined him. She owed me something. Inspector Cray stepped forward quietly. I think that's enough, ma'am. As he led her away, Miss Marple stood by the window, gazing out at the fading light over the garden. The world, she thought, was rarely divided neatly into guilt and innocence. It was made instead of small cruelties and larger mistakes of people who could not bear to lose what they thought was theirs by right. When she returned home that evening, she placed her knitting beside her chair and sighed softly. The village would settle again soon enough. It always did. There would be teas to pour, gardens to admire, gossip to exchange. But somewhere beneath the calm, the truth would linger like a faint echo that only the attentive could still hear. And Miss Marple, ever patient, ever observant, would be listening. The following morning broke clear and golden, a deceptive calm that belied the dark revelations of the previous day. The church bell tolled softly across Marymead as the villagers resumed their routine, sweeping front steps, tending roses, exchanging cautious greetings in hushed voices. They knew, by now, that Mrs. Bellamy had been taken away, though few understood exactly why. The newspapers would call it a case of misplaced loyalty. But Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her tea, thought it was far simpler than that. It was pride plain, human pride, disguised as affection, robed in good intentions. Pride, she knew, was the root of most sins she had encountered. Pride and the small, stubborn lies people tell themselves to make their wrongs feel righteous. She had slept little. Her mind kept replaying the look on Mrs. Bellamy's face, the sudden shattering of calm when she realized her performance was over. Miss Marple pitied her, though pity was often a dangerous indulgence. She pitied them all. Wake, foolish in his charm. Lydia, broken by misplaced trust. Even poor Mrs. Farrow, whose death had begun with the first seed of fear someone else had planted. Yet the matter was not entirely done. Inspector Cray had called just after dawn to say that Lionel Wake had asked to see her before his transfer to the County Gaol. He had insisted, almost pleaded for it. Miss Marple had agreed, though she did not expect gratitude. Murderers, she reflected, rarely sought forgiveness, they sought understanding, as though being understood could soften the edges of guilt. The police station at Market Bexley was a small, clean building, smelling faintly of ink and damp wool. Inspector Cray met her at the door, his manner brisk but respectful. He's calmer now, he said quietly as they walked down the narrow corridor. Almost relieved, I'd say. But there's something he wants to tell you, something about Mrs. Bellamy. I don't know if it's true. Miss Marple nodded, her step steady despite the weight of what she already knew. In the small holding cell, Lionel Wake sat on the edge of a cot, his once handsome face drawn and pale. The theatrical confidence was gone, replaced by a tired sort of dignity, like an actor after the final curtain. He looked up as she entered, managing a faint smile. Miss Marple, he said softly, the village's own nemesis. You must admit, it's rather poetic that it should end this way. I admit nothing of the sort, she said, folding her hands neatly before her. Poetry has little to do with murder, Mr. Wake. He gave a short, dry laugh. You're right, of course. I suppose I always needed an audience, even for my downfall. He leaned back, eyes distant. You've won, you know. I've no quarrel with it. But Mrs. Bellamy, did she tell you everything? I believe she told us enough, Miss Marple said quietly. She orchestrated the letter, used your vanity to frighten Mrs. Farrow. And when things went wrong, she was quite content to let you take the blame. He nodded slowly. That's near enough. But there's something you don't know. She didn't only want the money. She wanted her revenge on Mrs. Farrow, but not for her son, As she told you. His voice lowered. It was for herself. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. Go on. Years ago, he said, before her husband died, there was a scandal quietly buried. Mrs. Bellamy and Mrs. Farrow's late brother, the solicitor, had a relationship. It ended badly. Mrs. Farrow threatened to expose her if she didn't end it. She lost her position in the parish, her reputation, everything she did afterward, her friendship with Mrs. Farrow, her charitable heirs, it was all pretense. The letter she used wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about humiliation. She made Mrs. Farrow relive her brother's betrayal. That was the cruelty of it. Miss Marple's face remained calm, but inwardly she felt a chill that was not from the morning air. And you knew this? Wake nodded. She told me. She said the old woman deserved it. That she wanted her to die remembering every shameful thing her family had done to others. I thought it was melodrama. I thought it would make a good play. He gave a bitter laugh. But it wasn't a play. Was it? It was her revenge, and I was her stagehand. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. And now you hope that telling me this will lessen your guilt? He met her gaze with weary honesty. No, I just wanted you to know it wasn't only greed. There was hate in it too. And hate, Miss Marple, is a far more patient poison. When she left the cell, Inspector Cray was waiting in the hall. Anything new? He asked. Only the usual, she said softly. Love, resentment, and foolish pride. It's quite the old mixture. As they stepped outside, the autumn sun had begun to fade behind a veil of thin clouds. Miss Marple stood for a moment on the steps, watching a leaf spiral down onto the cobblestones. There's a lesson in it, Inspector, she said quietly. When people speak of forgiveness, they rarely mean to give it. They mean to keep the right to withhold it. He looked at her, puzzled, but respectful. You'll be giving evidence at the inquest, of course? Oh, yes, she said, her tone brisk again. But I think it will be quite short. The facts are clear enough now. When she returned to Mary Mead, dusk was settling over the village. The lamps in the vicarage glowed warmly through lace curtains. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the green. It was as though the village itself was eager to restore its routine, to bury its discomfort beneath the comforting rhythm of daily life. Miss Marple walked slowly along the path toward her cottage, nodding to those who passed her. The gossip had already softened into sympathy. People spoke now of Mrs. Bellamy's troubles, of Lionel Wake's weakness, of Mrs. Farrow's unfortunate heart. The rawness of guilt was being neatly ironed into respectability. Villages, Miss Marple thought, were very good at that. Inside her cottage, the fire burned low. She settled into her chair and began to write a short note to Lydia Crane. The girl had taken refuge with friends in Bath, away from the eyes and whispers of Mary Mead. Miss Marple's letter was gentle. Its words chosen with care, she spoke of courage, of healing, and of the importance of trusting one's instincts, even when they lead through sorrow. When she finished, she sealed it with a quiet sigh. Her gaze drifted to the mantel, where the little ivory-handled umbrella stood, now harmless and ordinary. Inspector Cray had returned it to her that morning after it had been examined. It was a curious thing, she thought, how such simple objects could contain so much wickedness. The handle's hollow had been filled with guilt, secrecy, and pride, and yet to look at it now, one would see only a neat, respectable umbrella, the sort one might take to church. A soft knock came at the door. It was the vicar's wife, bringing a basket of scones. "We're having tea tomorrow for the Harvest Fund," she said cheerfully. "I thought perhaps you'd like to help with the raffle." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, my dear. I should like that very much." When she was gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while in silence, listening to the faint ticking of the clock and the soft hum of the evening wind. The house was peaceful again, yet she knew peace was never permanent, Not in Mary Mead. Not anywhere. The world turned endlessly on its small human dramas, its jealousies, its deceptions, its kindnesses half-spoken, and its cruelties half-concealed. Outside, the church bell struck 9. Miss Marple rose and drew the curtains, the faintest of smiles touching her lips. Another story had ended, another tragedy neatly folded into the life of the village. Tomorrow, there would be tea and laughter, perhaps even a new scandal to whisper about. But tonight, for the first time in many weeks, she allowed herself to rest. The truth, after all, had been found, not the clean truth of logic or evidence, but the quieter truth of motive. That secret pulse beneath every polite conversation and every small deceit. And as she laid aside her knitting and turned out the lamp, she thought, with the serene certainty of one who has seen much of the world, that human nature was the most fascinating puzzle of all, one that no letter, no death, and no clever disguise could ever truly conceal.